So we have a presentation for you tonight, and I have some slides to share along the way, and we won't be sharing them the whole time, but I do have a couple here, some really a fun picture of both me and Essence in all our glory, but you've seen us now already. So we're going to start out. I think, Essence, you're going to lead us in some breathing, and then we're going to do a reading to get started tonight.
I am. So for this, we're just going to do some deep breathing to open our space as we're together, to kind of shake off the day that we've already had and prepare ourselves to be a part of this conversation together. And so as you are able, if all of you could plant your feet on the ground about hips width apart, you're welcome to do whatever you would like with your hands. Typically, I face my hands palms down on my thighs. And what I'm going to ask all of us to do is to just take 3 deep breaths. And so as you're able, for these 3 deep breaths, if you could do them at the same pace. So I like to count in for 3 seconds and then exhale for 3 seconds, and just do that 3 times, and then we'll get ourselves started.
We're going to begin with a reading called The Table by Caitlin Shetler. Sometimes I wonder if Mary breastfed Jesus, if she cried out when he bit her, or if she sobbed when he would not latch. And sometimes I wonder if this is all too vulgar to ask in a church full of men without milk stains on their shirts.
Or coconut oil on their breast, preaching from pulpits off limits to the Mother of God. But then I think of feeding Jesus, birthing Jesus, the expulsion of blood and the smell of sweat, the salt of a mother's tears onto the soft head of the salt of the earth.
Feeling lonely
and tired,
hungry,
annoyed,
overwhelmed,
lovingly.
And I think if the vulgarity of birth is not honestly preached by men who carry power, but not burden, who carry privilege, but not labor, who carry authority, but not submission, then it should not be preached at all.
Because the real scandal of the birth of God lies in the cracked nipples of a 14-year-old, and not in the sermons of ministers who say women are too delicate to lead. So we just want to thank all of you for engaging in our opening of this space, and being open, voluntarily participating in this conversation with us. And so we started out with this poem to set a tone, not just for how we are approaching the topic of reproductive justice in this sacred setting, but why. And so this conversation can be kind of difficult and awkward because of our negative and often shameful connotations of the human body and the behaviors that we engage in with our bodies. So, for example, those that can give birth are sometimes shamed for the ways that their bodies shift and change after giving birth. Teenagers across the world are left confused and anxious because many adults find it challenging to explain the hormonal changes of puberty. Or older adults are constantly expected to sort of magically know what to do with their bodies as they age, and as these bodies change rapidly, and also how to do that with dignity in our society. And so the list of questions about the body goes on and on and on. But what's important about this conversation is when we can acknowledge what's happening or what's causing difficulty to engage in a conversation of this nature, that is when we are able to unpack and move forward. So for some of you, it may be uncomfortable to even consider that Mary, mother of Jesus, had postpartum cracked nipples and was probably very upset about giving birth in a manger. But that's the conversation that we need to have, a conversation that centers the communal care of birth givers and the children they produce, a conversation that teaches us to support and comfort people who get abortions, a conversation that calls on each of us to think intentionally about the ways that the systems and institutions of our society impacts each of our individual bodily autonomy, and also why those things matter to Christians. Of course, we will not be covering all of that ground tonight, but we hope to set a foundation for why this conversation is important. So to start us off, we have a short activity to get us started that Amy is going to guide us through.
So I'm going to invite us to take another deep breath together in through our nose and out through our mouth. 2, 3, and I'm going to put something in the chat for you, and I'll say it too in case you don't have access to that feature. But I'm going to invite you to go to www.menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And there's a code when you get there that you can put in, and it will take you to a screen that I'm going to share. And the code is 8836899. And that, when you get there, you should see a question and be able to type in some answers. So the question is, what words come to mind when you think of the term reproductive justice? And if you type those in, you can type more than one. If you type a phrase, please put a hyphen in between the words so it stays all together. But if you type words, and you can type more than one, there's more than one, there should be more than one space for you to type in a word. As you enter those words, they're going to show up on the screen as a word cloud. So go ahead and do that now. What words come to your mind when you think of that term reproductive justice? Freedom, choice, equality, fairness, those seem to be the biggest words coming up so far. Lots of different ones. People, the ones in the middle, the ones that are bigger, those are words that more people have chosen. So the more people that choose a word, the bigger it shows up on the screen. So definitely freedom, choice, and equality are the biggest words that we have there. We also have fairness, respect, avoid, hope, OWL, comprehensive sex ed, woot woot, whoever said that, loss, injustice, safety, hypocrisy,
That's all right.
women, partisan issue, autonomy, empowerment, controversial, in vitro fertilization, health, options, access, respect, misunderstanding, self-autonomy. Oh, they all moved now. Not to be legislated, under assault, Planned Parenthood, misinformation, pro-choice, misunderstanding, abortion rights, empowerment, health, controversial, loss. Lots of different words that come to mind when we hear this term reproductive justice. So thank you for highlighting. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen now. Highlighting how complicated an issue this is and how much it encompasses. It's not one thing. Sometimes we find, Essence and I, when we were creating this presentation for you, we're very much aware that a lot of times people think of this reproductive justice as synonymous with something like choice or abortion rights, when it's really about so many things. Essence is going to take a few minutes and talk about some of the difference between terms that we hear and what they mean.
All right. Amy, did you have the PowerPoint or should I share?
I do. I can put that up.
Okay. I could also, but I have it in the web browser.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so there's, as Amy mentioned, there's a reason that we're referring specifically to reproductive justice. So many people use reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice interchangeably, but they are not the same because they have very different concepts with varying frameworks for how those concepts are used. And so I'm going to guide us through them pretty briefly using this graphic from our friends at the National Council of Jewish Women. So it'll start with the reproductive health, which is on your screen. So reproductive health in action calls on the delivery of reproductive services, accessibility to those services, and education about those services, all of which are honestly amazing. But the framework itself, or like the praxis of these concepts, focus on filling in where systems and institutions are failing for the individual person, rather than directly addressing the systemic issues that are oppressing the individual. And so the example that they have here on the graphic is unintended pregnancy due to lack of access to birth control or lack of education on effective birth control use, which is really helpful when we have like resources to help the individual person have that type of access. But then we have to ask ourselves the question of, is this person able to afford this type of private care? Does this person have access to transportation to get to these resources? What zip code does this person live in? And do they have equitable access to the resources being provided by these people? Which is some of the more like thoughts that led from reproductive health to reproductive rights. So reproductive rights, which is now on this screen, which some of you actually may be more familiar with. Reproductive rights, as stated in its name, has to do with the legality of reproductive services. So it focuses more on the individual, similar to reproductive health. It focuses on the individual, but it also focuses on the legal aspects of having reproductive rights. The only kind of iffy part about that, and I'll use I statements here in my example, is so some of my ancestors were considered 3/5 of a human being. So historically, legality in this country has not always equaled something being just. So while reproductive rights are extremely helpful to have in place and have secure at like a legal level, it does not guarantee that those reproductive services are accessible, that they're equitable, and that they're non-coercive for the communities that have to engage with them. And so a lot of thinkers and people doing on-the-ground work around this era started thinking that we needed a more holistic approach, which is where reproductive justice kind of comes in. So reproductive justice, which is now on your slide, speaks to the systemic power imbalances and the intricacies of our various identities and cultures. And so reproductive justice invites this conversation to be more holistic across identities. It asks of us, what is your race, your nationality? What is your age, your class? What is your zip code, which is also a really big part of the public health conversation. And we'll jump to the next slide. And for this, we're going to, the graphic provided by the National Council of Jewish Women was amazing.
Sorry.
I think it like kind of glides in one by one.
Yeah, okay, this one.
Yeah, there we go. As you can see, we're always working and learning. And so we're jumping to a definition coined by SisterSong. And so SisterSong is a reproductive justice collective based in Atlanta, Georgia. They were formed by 16 organizations made up of Native, Black, Latina, and Asian American women. And so it's important that as we move through this conversation, we highlight their ongoing work because they were one of the first prominent organizations in the country to solely focus on reproductive justice. And which is a major perk, the UCC shares many of their values and concerns. And so they define reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so this definition by itself is very sufficient, but most conversations around reproductive anything tend to begin and end with abortion, but abortion is not the full conversation. And so reproductive justice is a human right that goes beyond just choice. Reproductive justice is about providing access. And so giving people access to contraception, comprehensive sex education, STI prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence assistance, adequate wages to support our families, safe homes, and so much more. So this conversation involves all of us, but too often individuals don't join the reproductive justice conversation until they are directly oppressed or directly negatively impacted. Of course, the reproductive justice as a movement is not perfect. There's always room to grow, but in terms of being a holistic, in terms of really getting the full picture of who we are as people and all of the identities and aspects of our lives, and imagining amazing ways for all of us to live, the reproductive justice movement in and of itself is very revolutionary. And what's great about that is the UCC joined this conversation very early on, not just for reproductive justice, but dating back to the earlier foundations of reproductive rights and women in particular being concerned about this topic. And so I'll pass it over to Amy to say a bit more about that.
Thank you, Essence. And I think, yeah, I just really want to highlight how important that information is that you just went through with us. That I know one of the first emails I had with Diane was, can you talk about why men should care about this issue, why women should care about this issue, why is there a different conversation going on in communities that are predominantly white than in communities of color? And I hope that this has helped you understand why this is about everybody. When we're talking about reproductive justice, we're talking not only about a body with a uterus deciding whether or not to carry or terminate a pregnancy for any one of the millions of reasons that might happen, but also we're talking about the ability to choose life in terms of having resources available to parent children and bring them up in healthy ways if somebody does choose to have children. So whether you are birthing children or not, it is important, no matter what gender you are, to be a part of this conversation and to know that it includes all of these things and that it's more about access than it is about choice. Do you have the access to the education and information you need to even make a decision and understand if that's a decision that you can make in an informed way? And what about other issues that come up like STIs or alternative birth options or adequate care? And zip codes play a huge part in that. So another thing that we were asked was, what is the UCC history about this? And that is just a lovely question because there's just so much, right? And if we look at all of these issues, we could go on forever. So I did kind of zoom in a little bit more on the reproductive health and rights aspect of this in terms of the UCC. So as you can see, this starts and goes way back even before Roe v. Wade was law. the history of the General Synod actions and resolutions, which is what we turn to when we say, what does the UCC say about something? We need to go to the General Synod, because we're such a congregational denomination that the General Synod is when we come together all together and have a voice together about a resolution or an action that the entire denomination wants to make a statement about. So as early as 1971, the General Synod resolutions were advocating to repeal restrictions on abortions and to provide education about what personhood is, about human life, about sexuality, about what they called population control at that time, about family life, to expand sex education and family life education, to expand education about contraception, and to expand the access, to assist people in choosing options for unwanted pregnancy. So giving education about what options are, and to expand family planning services and develop ministries for support of what at that time, 50 years ago was called disadvantaged minority groups. And so again, thinking about where are the disparities in access and where do we need to have a voice about that? In 1973, when the Supreme Court did legalize and took a stance on Roe v. Wade, then the General Synod took action to affirm that decision and reaffirm all of the things that it was talking about in 1971. In the 70s were a busy time in the UCC. Again, there's another, call to reaffirm the right. So obviously this is, as we said at the beginning, an ongoing conversation that's complicated. We never sort of get there with this issue. So again, the rights were reaffirmed, and it deplored the action of the Supreme Court to uphold the Hyde Amendment. What the Hyde Amendment does is it bans federal funding for abortion. And what that does then is make abortion access less available to poor women and women of color and anyone on the margins. And so this was us taking a stand and being a voice and saying, anytime that we take an action as a government that restricts this right, we are disproportionately giving out a service. We're not actually saying abortion is legal and safe in our country. We're saying it's legal and safe for a subset of people. And then in 1979, again, actions were reaffirmed. And then there was some specific language about affirming that people are able to choose abortion as a faithful act. And also reminding people of the clergy support network in the 60s and 70s before Roe versus Wade, which provided counseling for safe abortion and contraception services before Roe v. Wade. And then acknowledging again the divide between poor and wealthy women and the access. In 1981, the specific language was around choosing, the right to choose, and moral agency was imperative. That we are saying, every person in the United Church of Christ, we believe every person is a beloved child of God and has moral agency to make a faithful decision about their own body. And that abortion should not be primarily used as birth control. And again, education and family planning access are important. You can tell from looking at these and sort of the nuances that there are conversations going on. And so in 1987, there was an affirmation of the sacredness of life, in addition to the right to agency and choice. This is in the 80s when there started to be a lot of call for study and education about human sexuality in churches. This is a precursor to the Our Whole Lives on Sexuality and Our Faith programs that we have today in the United Church of Christ and Unitarian Universalist Association. But you also see that we're calling for adequately funded health and childcare. So now you see that bridge to the reproductive justice portion of this, that it's not just about reproductive rights, it's also about healthcare and childcare are an important part of having a healthy life and healthy choices in our lives. Again, advocating for support and counseling for people who are facing an unwanted or unintended pregnancy. And then urging clergy and constituents and congregants not to undermine access to safe and legal abortion. So even if this was something that somebody didn't believe in, to say, don't undermine the access to it. Even if you don't want to be preaching or taking a public stand for the choice and for the access to not undermine it. In 1989, we affirmed our own historically courageous leadership in support of freedom and choice, and deplored a Missouri law that prohibited the use of public facilities and employees for abortion unless it was medically necessary. So you start to see these restrictions come in, and they've just gotten more and more and more tight depending on states over the years and decades. In 1991, we supported overturning restrictions on information about options available for pregnancy. So this is when some of those crisis pregnancy centers started to come up, where they're not even giving all of the options to people and letting people know what their options are. And then wanting to work on distributing and creating resources for, this language says women, regarding the full range of options. And again, the support and care for people around unintended pregnancy. And then in 1991, there was a specific call to have a responsible and faithful male role. So again, showing that bridge to reproductive justice, that this isn't just a narrow issue of one type of body. This has to do, babies don't just poof get created. It takes people making decisions together to have that happen. There's quite a gap about specific reproductive rights and choice and justice issues. There are some things that are tangential to them in the intervening years here. But in 2013, there was specifically a resolution that supported a full range of healthcare for women, and recognizing that women, again, have rights to make their own decisions about reproductive health. So the key takeaways from all of this, and there's even more, and you can look up the resolution to archive if you want and find all them. It's kind of fascinating to go back through our history and see how many times we reaffirm things as a denomination. But there are multiple resolutions and actions affirming the choice of a pregnant person about whether or not to continue a pregnancy. There are multiple mentions of moral agency and acting faithfully, that it is recognized that a person can make a moral choice, a faithful choice to choose to have an abortion. There are multiple times acknowledging the disparity of service by the Hyde Amendment and other state laws. These resolutions as a whole take a holistic viewpoint, and as a whole, if you look at them, they really are supporting reproductive justice, not just reproductive health or reproductive rights, but reproductive justice by advocating for healthcare, for childcare, for sexuality education, for support, for counseling, for all of those things that create a healthy community, and urging clergy and other people not to undermine the choice that someone makes and undermine the ability of somebody to make a choice. So, time for another deep breath, I think. Let's take another deep breath. And I want to say that as we move into this next piece, which is about what is the UCC theology about abortion and about reproductive rights and about reproductive justice. So we found this great graphic that we thought we would share with you, because it's so complicated, right? It's so many things. And when we ever talk about what does the UCC say about something, we need to remember that our polity as a denomination is a broad tent. We're a broad tent. And so when we say, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here, what we mean is you can have a different belief than I do and still be a member of the United Church of Christ. We don't have a polity that's top down that says you will believe this. The General Synod actions and resolutions are the national setting takes our cues from those about what we work on. But those are a collection of all of our voices coming together and discerning in committees about what those resolutions should and shouldn't say. And then the entire denomination, representatives from the entire denomination voting on whether or not we should have that as something that we lift up. So the United Church of Christ theology is as varied as its members. My theologies may be different from your theology, but the United Church of Christ is full of a bunch of theologies. And Essence and I thought it might be helpful for you to hear a little bit about our own theologies and what we bring to this and the perspective that we bring to this, in case it's helpful to you. So for example, from my perspective, in my position and with my discernment, I believe strongly that God is always standing on the margins with people who are marginalized, and that Jesus is all about community and about abundance for everyone and inclusion for everyone, and that Jesus came to disrupt patriarchal power structures, to disrupt misogyny, to disrupt white supremacy, and that is all still here today. So part of my faith is always going to be about being a voice for disrupting the power that keeps oppression in place. Essence, what would you add from your perspective?
I just want to say thank you, Amy, for sharing with us. But in addition to that, mostly because many of my own personal theologies align with Amy's, just really emphasizing community is a part of my personal theology, mostly because I grew up in a very marginalized identity. I grew up poor, Black, and in the South. And so community has always been of the utmost importance in my religious background, and also in just practice of how we all live and are together. And it is often frightening and alarming to see the ways that the people in our community aren't being met with care and love, and the way that as Christians, we hope that we can all meet everyone with. And so, in addition to what Amy is saying, just also being aware of what's happening with my neighbor is always of the utmost importance to me, because if they're hungry and I'm not feeding them, or if they need shelter and I'm not providing it, although I can, for me, it just doesn't show where I align. And I typically try to align with the biblical Christ. And so my own personal theology and my personal drive comes from that type of lived experience of community and being present, and being intentional, which is also ironically very much aligned with what reproductive justice is as a holistic and womanist movement. So
yeah, we are so aligned, so aligned, and we know that this isn't always an easy place for people to land. I know that in my experience, I have met many people who are very clear that they are advocates for reproductive justice, but they wonder, like, where do I find that in the Bible? Because the sort of Christian narrative that's out there is one that is different from what you just heard Essence and I say as our beliefs and how we align with the Bible and the biblical Christ and theology and those kinds of things. So rather than telling you the answer, we have decided to give you an opportunity to be in some small groups together that we will randomly select. Essence is putting that breakout rooms, getting those set right now. And we're going to invite you to take, 7-8 minutes to wrestle with this question here. Hang on a second. I need to get back to this. To wrestle in your small groups to the extent that you're willing. This is 100% consensual activity, so you do not have to share if you do not feel comfortable sharing. But we believe that it might be helpful for you to at least consider, what are the theological stances around reproductive justice that cause you tension or make you uncomfortable, and why? So what are the theological stances around reproductive justice that cause you tension or make you uncomfortable, and why? Thank you, Emma, for putting that in the chat. So we're going to take several minutes. We're going to, I think, stop the recording during the small group time. And when we come back, we'll have some time to discuss how that experience was for you and to take some questions and answers as well. So that's just kind of where we're headed with the rest of our time tonight.